Michael Provo through many other previous things. Channel 13 is up there. They're going to record his presentation, so it'll be back on the air at some point.
I'm sure.
All right, thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. The mill history is near and dear to my heart. I started doing it when they started the Heritage Festivals. I was asked to give some talks, and it was very exciting then because we got to go in the empty mills and got to walk through, and then after everybody went out, I had to run through all of the mills alone to make sure everybody was out so I could lock them up again. But this is something that we've been thinking about for a long time, is that something that we can present to people and have in our archives regarding the history of the mills. So without further ado, there's no way in 40 minutes or so that we can tell you the whole history of the mills. But in the beginning, this is a drawing by Sylvia Fitzgerald, our first curator, of the first falls of the Lamprey. She made it look much nicer than what they actually are. But there was an Indian settlement, that would be Heron Point, on the right, and on the left side would have been the mills and Main Street. Now the Indians encamped there, and of course the big reason they did was for the fishing and the weirs and the oysters and the harvesting of things on the bay. By 1752, the settlement there had been abandoned by the Indians, and they had moved further north. So, but in the early days, when the settlers were first here, they still did camp there. And the next slide is Newmarket in, again, this is Sylvia's map. This is the beginnings of the town of Newmarket, when it was Lamprey River Village. The dotted things are the roads. It was really interesting because there were only 5 roads in town originally. There was the country road to Oyster River Falls, which would be Durham and Dover. Rubberland Road, which is Bay Road. There was the road to Ash Swamp, which came off of the country road to Exeter. The road to Ash Swamp would connect with Grant Road, which, and most of these were paths, they weren't roads. Elm Street at the time was actually subject to gates and bars, and it was called the path to Piscassic Falls. And Piscassic Falls, of course, is where the old water treatment plant is. And there was Packers Falls Road. That was pretty much it, except for Pinder's Lane in downtown Newmarket, which is sort of the area of Creighton Street, Mount Pleasant Street, up in that area. And back away from the river a little bit was Spring Pump Road, which is Spring Street. And that was on the opposite side of the hill. The main street of Newmarket at this time was right alongside the river. As a matter of fact, in the late 1700s, people complained to the selectmen at the time that there was too much clutter on the waterfront. They couldn't get their boats in and out because there were shipbuilding ways and the fishermen and everything else. The tavern was there, Branscom's Tavern, Tenney's Store, the Pinders and the Cram Houses, and wharfs. Next slide. The mills came here because of water. And what's really interesting is in March of 1823, 4 strangers got off the stage from Newburyport at Branscom's Tavern and started walking up and down along the waterfront. And they were especially interested in 2 sites. There was a carding mill, which was the beginning of a textile mill, and Ebenezer Smith's sawmill that were at the falls of the Lamprey. They were pointing, talking amongst themselves, didn't say anything to anyone. Then they got back on the stage and went back to Newburyport. They were actually from Salem, Mass. And the Town was a little bit abuzz, what was going on. About a week later, a man by the name of Stephen Hansen from Dover, who was a Quaker, came to town, and he started buying property in Newmarket. And word soon got out, Branscom's store and tavern and house, the Pinder houses, Cram's Wharf, Elm Tree Wharf, Wharf number 5, all of the waterfront along the Lamprey, Ebenezer Smith Sawmill, were all bought up. It was not a universally happy time for the town. Half of the townspeople thought, this is going to be wonderful, it's going to make us wealthy, we're going to have lots of people coming in, there'll be industry and business. And the other half of the people said it's going to be the ruination of our lives and our way of life. And thus started a 200-year love-hate relationship with the mills in Newmarket. People either love them or people hate them. And it's been that way for a long time. When they came here and when they started buying this property, the first thing they did was survey the Lamprey River. Lamprey River is the largest river totally within the state of New Hampshire. There's no shared borders. Its source and its access to the bay is all totally within the state. They surveyed, which meant people walking with chains, and they would carry the chain. When they got to the end, the person behind them would carry the chain. They surveyed the river all the way from its point where it turned into the bay to its source in Pawtuckaway. They also surveyed the North River, the Piscassic River, the Oyster River, and they had dams and water rights that they purchased on all of those rivers because they needed to control the flow of water because it was the water power that was going to run the looms. Next slide. So mill number 1 and mill number 2 were built, they started building them in 1823. And mill number 1 is the one on the left, the one with the cupola on top, had a bell in it, had a clear story roof, which is a big row of windows to let in light. This was totally unheard of in this area. You have to remember that it was 1.5, 2-story buildings. There were no 7-story buildings in Newmarket at the time. So people were in absolute awe of this. The first mill was built at a cost of $11,297 and 30 some odd cents. And it cost about $297 more than it would have cost to build a brick. But they chose to use the locally quarried granite, and we're very glad they did because we have some of the best examples of early industrial stone mill architecture in the Northeast. The first 3 mills and the storehouses were all built of the granite. Next slide. While this was going on, and the mills, they also were purchasing a lot of other things, but there was a rock in the river, and it was making it kind of hazardous at low tide to try to get the boats in with the granite and everything else. There was a gentleman by the name of Walter Bryant, and as far back as the 1647, they basically referred to survey markers as 20 rods from the foot of the falls to the rock by the side of the road. That was known as Bryant Rock. By 1823, the Smith brothers actually had inherited the Bryant estate, and they were the owners. And Stephen Hansen decided it was in the way, so he blew it up. However, he neglected to ask the people who owned it whether or not they wanted it blown up. He also blew up the boundary marker for most of downtown Newmarket at the time. So that went to court, okay? They were also negotiating because while they were here, they weren't just building the mill. They built the blacksmith shop, they built the dam, they built the mill agent's house, they built a canal. The town's fathers had decided that this wasn't going to bode well to have Main Street, because at the time, when you crossed over the bridge from Durham side, you came down along where Penstock Way is and right along the waterfront. So all the houses and stuff were on one side, all the wharfs were on the other. So they voted at that time to move Main Street 150 feet up to where it is today. And a lot of the houses and things we think were moved from the waterfront up here on the Main Street at the time. So this went to court with a lawsuit. And they were actually at the time negotiating with the Smith brothers to open up a road 35 feet wide through their property, connecting from Spring Pump Road down to the new Main Street, because they needed to start building housing for the workers. And so they needed to have roads. And so they said no, not until the lawsuits settled. Well, not to forego an opportunity, Deacon Murray, up on top of the hill on what's now Chapel Street, said, well, you know, for $500, you can open up a road 35 feet wide down through my orchard. So Newmarket got Chapel Street. And not to be outdone, the Chapman family, who lived a little further along in the hills, said, well, for $500, you can open up a road 35 feet wide up through our orchard in our pastures. And so that's how we got Church Street. Okay, that's how Newmarket got the steepest streets in the seacoast. Think about it. Okay, and a lot of the houses that looked somewhat the same, those were some of the early houses that were built by the mills. They also put in another street that was actually where the parking lot is in Newbury Farms, called High Street. And there were houses built there. And on the Main Street coming up the hill, where the community garden is, where the foundation is, there actually, originally, there were 2 4-story brick boarding houses there for the workers who came to the mills. So that's enough for Bryant Rock, but that wasn't the only contentious thing. The cotton bales start arriving. They weighed about 500 pounds each. They actually came in by 3-masted schooners, and they came right up the river, right up to the mills. And if you go down the river today on some rocks, you'll notice big rings that are driven into the rocks. Those weren't to tie up your boat. When the schooners would come up into the mouth of the river, they would lose the wind. So they would come in on the incoming tide, and they put someone in a rowboat with a big long rope, and he would row over to the ring, put the rope through the ring, row it back to the ship, and the crew of the ship would run the length of the ship with a rope, and they literally pulled these 3-masted schooners up into the mouth of the river and the wharves. After 1857, when the trains came in, cotton came in by train, but they still came in by 3-masted schooners also. So next. So who worked here first? Well, the first workers, and they weren't workers, the factory owners referred to them as operatives, because you needed people to operate the looms. So therefore, they didn't work for them, they were operators. And so the first operators were women from the farms, young ladies. It was very different back then if you were a young woman, because you pretty much stayed on the farm, and your mother stayed on the farm. And you cared for the garden, and you did the cooking, and you did the cleaning, and you cared for the chickens, and you put up canning and things like that. And if you wanted to escape that as a young lady, you would marry some young guy, and you'd go to his house, his farm, help his mother do the cooking and the cleaning and stuff like that. Because it was the men that got out to socialize. That's why things like quilting bees and things like that were so important to the women back then, because a lot of times you would go for months without being around another woman, because Dad did the shopping, he did the marketing, went to the market and all of this. So this was a chance for them to get out and earn some money and socialize together. So they thought it was a pretty good idea. This is an obituary notice, and I was trying to get the picture of the boarding house, but I couldn't find it. Our website's down with some of our pictures now, and it's in there. But it's the death of Sally Emerson, widow of the late Benjamin Emerson, chronicled last week. She was a venerable and worthy woman, passed away, reminding us that the beloved and cherished ones of a past generation are leaving us. She was born at Durham Point in 1808 on the homestead now owned by Charles Smart. That name ought to be a little familiar. She was the oldest and the last to survive of a family of 11 children. Cold winters back then, folks. And she had 6 children, all of whom are living and were present at the funeral. Also 8 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Her life and labors are connected with the early history of the village. She was being one of the first that helped to start the looms going in the first mill built. She was one of the first ladies hired, basically. So this was her passing, and they marked it. Next slide. This is the working day. What?
What was the date of that obituary, do you know?
The what?
The date of the obituary.
Newmarket Advertiser, or the Fosters. The what?
The date of the obituary.
It would have been probably about 1880s. The working day, there's actually no date on it. We just have the obituary. Working day for the workers were 6 a.m. until 6 p.m., 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Skilled weaver operatives, $2.72 a week. There were 3 out of the entire mills at the time that were considered skilled operatives. Fine work operatives were $2.29 a week. Coarse work operatives were $1.80 a week. Helpers, that would be children that changed bobbins and collected the lint, things like that, $1 a week. Now, you had to remember that it was not bad at the time. However, you lived in the boarding house, and you had to pay board and room to the mills for living in the boarding house. And if you were a single young lady, you were required to live in the boarding house, and you were required to go to church on Sunday, and there was a woman who was in charge of the boarding house. If you were a family, you were renting your house from the mills, so they were getting money from the rent. And also there was the company store. Company store was located where Panzanella's is now. And you could buy on credit. They were also known as pluck me's. Pluck me, pluck my bones until I'm dead. Because so many families got into trouble by the credit extended that by the time their paychecks came in, there was really nothing left for them because they had purchased things at the store, paid the rent and everything else. Next slide. The most popular mill agent that came in up through the first 50 years was Captain John Webster. And that he was popular because he abolished the company store. And until that time, nobody in Newmarket that had a business could compete with the mills because they were buying in such bulk. So the prices were always higher in the local stores, so even people who didn't work for the mills would buy from the mills. And Newmarket economically really didn't take off until Captain John Smith decided he would abolish the company store. He didn't like it, he didn't like the system. So the rentals were still there and everything else. Now, along the time that Stephen Hansen came in, some of you may remember the old Eagles building, Fraternal Order of the Eagles. It was actually much longer than that. It was added on to, but this was the original FOE. Before that, it was the house of Wiggin Doe. Now, Wiggin Doe was a descendant of some of the first settlers of Newmarket, and when the mill agents came in and they started building the mills, he had a little 2-story house, which was that house, and it faced the river, and the road went in front of his house, and he was there, and they were blasting, and they were building mills, 2 mills, 3 mills, blacksmith shop, canal, wharfs, the agent's house, okay, all the housing, the brick boarding houses behind him, and they kept asking him if he would sell his house. And he said no, he was happy where he was. Well, they bugged him so much that finally he signed his house over to his daughter Deborah, and he said, there, go bug her, because I'm tired of dealing with you. So at that point in time, in town, if you didn't do what people wanted you to do, you were known to be as stubborn as Wiggin Doe. So that went on for 13 years, and finally he passed away, and his daughter Deborah agreed to sell the house to the Mills. And a very excited mill agent at the time telegraphed the mill owners down in Salem and said, we just acquired the house in the middle of the road. What do we do with it? And they said, turn it into an office. So Wiggin Doe's house actually became the office for the Mills. That's where you would go to get paid, get hired, and things like that, or if you got into trouble. So when it came time to name the road going down there, of course, I suggested it should be Wiggin's Way, right? No, it's Penstock Lane, but I don't know. I still think Wiggin's Way is a better name. And Wiggin, his wife, and their daughter are all buried up in Great Hill Cemetery, which is actually, by the way, Newmarket's oldest cemetery within the present-day boundaries of Newmarket. Newmarket's oldest cemetery is actually in Newfields next to Dunkin' Donuts, because Newmarket and Newfields were the same town originally until the 1840s when Newfields separated and became the town of Newfields. And our meeting house was actually there too, yes.
Mike, so the FOE, the old FOE building, was that the Doe house?
Yes.
So,
If you went upstairs in the attic of the old FOE building, it would be like going in the upstairs attic of Wiggin Doe's house. The stairs, the railing, it was the old hand-turned things and stuff like that. In the basement, actually, and it was just the north section that was left, pretty much the north wall of that building was Wiggin Doe's, because in the bake oven from the kitchen and stuff was still there.
that was just demolished, maybe 1980?
No, that wasn't demolished until like 2014.
There you go. Yeah, so very recent.
It was acquired by the Community Development Corporation, because anyone that was going to develop the mills was going to want the courtyard viewed and be opened. And so Wiggin, he lasted quite a while.
Been around for a long time.
Yeah, next slide. So, people say, where did people come from? The great expansion period for the mills was basically the 1865 to 1914 era. That's where it became this huge complex. Of course, the Irish started coming in because of the potato famine. French Canadians, starting in 1840 up until 1930, were crossing back and forth around the borders. After the Civil War, there was a huge influx of soldiers returning home. That these young farm boys went off to war, and they went to Washington, D.C., and they had seen New York City. And when they came back, they didn't want to be on the farm, so they wanted to go to the city. So they had the availability of these workers. The Italians, the Risorgimento, which is where they basically cobbled together all of the Italian principalities across 11 years, was a time of unrest, so Italians came in. Yes, we had a lot of Italians in Newmarket. Some of the families still around. We had Greeks that came in when Greek was declaring its independence, Greece. From 1860 to 1920, there was a lot of unrest. The Polish migration started in 1870 and lasted until 1914 in the outbreak of World War I, but it also picked up after Poland became disassociated itself and got out of the communist bloc. Poles started coming into the United States in bigger numbers too. And we actually had a late migration, which was in the late 70s, when the two churches in town, they each sponsored a Lao family, and they actually came in and they went to work for Timberland Shoe because they needed people in the workforce, and they were very hard workers, and it worked out well, and that's why Timberland Shoes stayed in Newmarket as long as it did. So Newmarket has always welcomed new people, generally. But there were times where, you know, if you were Polish, you didn't go into certain parts of town on Saturday night because the Irish would beat you up. And there's stories about, you know, the kids growing up. They would slide down the hill, and the Polish people would wait at the bottom and beat up the French Canadians, you know. And then when the Polish people tried to climb up and slide the hill, French Canadians would throw them back down the hill, you know. So there was a lot of that going on. Mill number 5 was built at this time after the Civil War. It was the first mill building that was not built of cut granite. It's built of trap rock. Trap rock is loose rock that was around the quarries, laying around and stuff like that. They did use cut granite quoins, which are the corner blocks for that building. And unlike the older buildings, mill number 1, mill number 2, mill number 3, and the ones in between them, when you go into those buildings and you're down in the basements, the walls are 42 inches thick. Okay, when you get to the upper floors, the walls are only 18 inches thick. And that is because each floor rested on the floor below. So as they went up each story, the walls would kick out, and it gave them a ledge to rest the timbers on. Even doing that, the looms had so racked mill number 1 that by the 50th anniversary in 1873, they needed to clean it out and rebuild the interior because of the vibrations from the looms. And that's also when they put the iron bolts through the buildings that you see. And you'll see later in a picture why, because they put as many looms in as they could into these mills. And they were weaving cotton. And it was just plain, unbleached cotton shirting and sheeting, like a muslin. And we weren't fancy. Dover had the calico dye plant and everything else over there, and the stamping factory and all that. We didn't have that. They could ship it out and have it done, but they didn't do that here in Newmarket. It wasn't until the late 1880s that they started introducing silk into the community. So, but they were doing millions of yards of cotton per month and shipping it out of Newmarket. They had a whole fleet of packet boats that used to go out all over the bay. The Fox, the Greyhound, the Lady, the Lafayette, the Factory Girl, the Monroe. So that is that. This is on Main Street. This is the Main Street Mill. This is a rope wheel, and it actually helped drive some of the pulleys, and the pulley systems that ran these looms were incredible. Everybody thinks it's a water wheel, but it's not a water wheel. It was ropes and belts on it. Next slide. Okay, this is water-powered looms. Okay, see the pulleys that are up on the ceiling? There are belts that go from the floor up to the ceiling. There's no guards. This is why you see the women always had very tight sleeves, always had their hair up. Because if you wore your hair loose, you had loose sleeves, it was easy to get caught up in this. This is where children got hurt too, because they used to walk between these rows of looms, down in between, and collect the lint that was part of it. This is the spinning room, not the weaving room. But when you see the weaving room, it's even worse. So next slide. This is the mill supervisor's office. It's nice. It's inside the mill. They've got a cage, so people talk through the cage to get to them. These were clerks. Those are like spreadsheets. Each worker, you know, they tracked how much they did, how much, you know, everything that was coming through. Next slide. This is one of the earliest pictures we have looking upriver at the mills. And what's neat about it is you can see the old warehouses and stuff. That's where Shanda Park is. Behind that, poking up, is the Lang's Blacksmith Shop. The extension sticking out back further is the kitchen area of the Newmarket House Hotel. But the smokestack way to the right is actually a gasification plant. That was when they introduced gas lighting into the mills, and that also caused fires and things like that. And notice that the brick mill buildings are only 2 stories. They did not have the upper stories put on until much later. Okay, next slide. Ambrose Nichols. Ambrose Nichols was one of the longest lasting mill agents in Newmarket. He was here for over 22 years. And he saw there were times when the cotton mills were not always efficient, and they didn't always make money for the owners because it was dependent on the water. And even having all the water rights flowing into the lamprey and everything, there were times when the mills would be idle because they didn't have enough water to run all the looms. So they would cable other mills in Pawtucket or Lowell or Fall River, and these mills, if they needed workers, would pay for a train ticket, and they'd put them on the train, and they would ship them down there to work there so that they didn't lose the skilled workers. And that's why sometimes in families, you try to do genealogy, and all of a sudden, well, we've always lived in Newmarket. Well, the hell was he born in Pawtucket, Rhode Island? That's why. There was another reason later on, too. So he introduced silk, and he introduced it in what's the present-day Rivermore Landing building. That's where the silk actually started. And silk was notoriously difficult to work with. It was very brittle, and it really took some skill to do it. And it became more and more popular. They always continued with the cotton. The silk was an added thing, and the silk was actually used for lining for men's hats, lining for coats, for women's hats, for men's ties. There were pattern makers that were here in Newmarket that actually created patterns for them to weave. They also did damask, satins, pongees, many different types of cloth, specialty ones. And if you go on the garden tour and you go to the museum on Saturday, you will be able to see some of the scraps of cloth on display that were woven here in Newmarket by Newmarket people. And we're very fortunate to have those. Next slide. That brought about mill number 8, the Great Weave Shed. The Great Weave Shed was to be the shining light for the Newmarket Manufacturing Company. And Ambrose Nichols started the process right around the turn of the century when High Street was eliminated, and all of the houses on High Street and the left side of Elm Street were moved. And that's when they created Nichols Avenue for Ambrose Nichols, and Washington Street, Lincoln Street, Elm Court. That's all those, they never tore anything down back then. It got moved and reused. The one thing they did tear down was the big brick boarding houses, which were gorgeous. And next slide. Great Weave Shed was completed in 1917, and it was 5 acres under one roof, and it was the largest single-room weave shed in the world when it was built. But it also had problems. It had a beautiful sawtooth roof with glass on the flat sides, but this is New England, and New England, what happens? We get snow, and it freezes, and it turns to ice, and it cracks the glass. The building roof always leaked, so that was always a problem. You could go from one end of the complex to the other without ever having to go outside. They had overhead walkways. That's the one over Main Street. Next slide. This is mill number 8, its grand opening. See the piano on the stage. The chairs would be for the dignitaries. Everybody else stood. But there was a free popcorn machine over in the corner. But they had a big grand opening and everything was exciting. And you need to think 1917, 1916, you know, building it and everything. Took them 1 year to build it. Next slide. On Main Street looking north, that's the overhead walkway between mill number 5, where Savannah Kitchen is, and the community garden. Next slide. Agents of the Newmarket Manufacturing Company. There were, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There were like 13 agents. Some of them only lasted a few months, but that's the list of who was there and most of the years as far as we can get. Walter Gallant continued to be a mill agent after 1934, but not in Newmarket. Because, next slide, there he is, the last mill agent. Next slide. 1929, if you read Foster's Daily Democrat in February of 1929, the first thing on the front page says how bright the cotton outlook is and how good it's going to be for local businesses. And on February 19th, the town that food itself happened. There was a series of labor unrest in the mills, 1914, 1922, 1929, when the International Brotherhood of United Textile Workers tried to unionize the workers. Everybody in 1929 and all the other mills were getting pay raises. In Newmarket, they cut their pay for the third time. And 17 ladies in the great weave shed in the silk mill walked out in protest because not only did they cut their pay, they increased the number of looms that they worked. And you can see, these are the looms. That's how crowded it was in the mills, okay? And these are actually electric, but can you imagine it with all the belts running up to the ceiling? What it was like in there and with little kids running around? So basically, they walked out in protest, and 1,200 workers followed them out, okay? The mill agent locked the doors behind them. Okay? Was it a walkout? Was it a protest? Was it a strike? It was a perfect storm. At that point in time, the town of Newmarket, the mill's Newmarket Manufacturing Company, paid 89% of the tax rate. Okay? Because not only were the properties taxed, but at that point in time, you could tax their supplies and their inventory of goods. And they kept telling the town fathers that, hey, you're charging us too much. And the town fathers are like, well, you got 14 acres of downtown, 256 buildings, you got to pay taxes. If you don't like it, go see the Revenue Administration. So they did, and they lost, and they didn't like it. In 1920, just as a hint, the Newmarket Manufacturing Company gave up its corporate charter in the state of New Hampshire and rechartered in Massachusetts 9 years before 1929. Was it a strike? Was it a planned exit? Okay, it gets better. So martial law was declared because things got a little rough. The mills decided they were going to evict. They served 217 evictions out of Rockingham County Superior Court to the workers that were living in the housing there. The one thing they neglected to tell the judge was that most of the workers paid their rents 6 months at a time. So they were evicting people that were paid through June. So people weren't happy. Martial law was declared at one point in time. They were looking at putting up a tent city with a National Guard, with field kitchens and everything else on the Johnson Farm, which was where Pulaski Drive is in that area, coming out of town. They hired 22 marshals, special marshals that patrolled the town and the property. The strikers could not stop, but they could walk. So what they did was they walked from the library down Main Street, up Central Street, down Spring Street, and down Elm Street back to the library all day long. And they carry their signs or whatever. There's actually a lawsuit that's still outstanding because Maddie Durgan thought that one of the mill worker girls was a little too uppity and didn't get out of the way for her. She was one of the grand dams in town, you know, sailing through with her. Out of the way, out of the way. So she swore out a warrant for her, and that warrant still exists, but the girl left town before it could be served. And that's still an outstanding warrant for this poor Polish woman. It was just horrible. Walter Gallant, the Secretary of Labor, came to Newmarket in order to negotiate between the workers and the mill owners. And Walter Gallant couldn't be there that day because he was in Concord testifying against the 40-hour work week. Tells you what kind of guy he was. The selectmen didn't trust the business owners, didn't trust the mill workers, didn't trust the mill owners didn't trust the workers. It got worse and worse and worse. So basically, it was not until like 1931 that actually things got settled. By that point in time, the population of Newmarket was decimated. Businesses were decimated. People weren't speaking to each other. And I was able to interview some people in town, and I said, you know, why didn't you leave when the other people left? And they said, well, we did. We went and worked in the mills, and my sister stayed home and took care of the house and the kids and kept the house going, and my parents sent money back so that we could stay here. But it was 6 to 8 weeks wait for a horse-drawn cart to come and pick up your household goods and take them to the train station so you could leave town. It took until 1970 for the population of Newmarket to get back to where it was in 1929. Okay? The strike was settled, but they never went back to full capacity. They never employed more than 300 people. Fast forward to 1934, and they had finally gone to the state Supreme Court, the mills, with this tax issue with the town, and they lost again. So they declared abandonment. They literally walked away from all of the mill buildings, all of the houses, anything to do with Newmarket, and went off to Lowell, Mass. And when it says the town that fooled itself, one of the things that the strikers were worried about is the day after they were locked out of the mills, trucks appeared and they started pulling looms out of the mills and loading them into the trucks, and they would take off. And people said, oh, don't worry about it. They're just trying to fool us and get us upset. When we go to bed at night, they bring the trucks back and put them back in, then they take the same ones out the next day. No. Cotton was never manufactured in Newmarket after 1929. There was just a skeleton crew doing some silk work, only about 300 people that were left employed by the mills. Next slide. So January 14th, 1934, this is the top floor of mill number 5, which is the Sam Smith Shoe Building on Main Street, and this was a recovery dinner. These were townspeople that were left. They were very excited because they actually got a tenant for one of the buildings, because the town had no money coming in taxes. Oh, and the other thing of the perfect storm, the town treasurer at the time was found embezzling funds from the town of Newmarket. So the town had no money, almost had to close schools and everything, and the treasurer was embezzling too. So it was a really rough time, but this was the recovery dinner. It brought hope. But still, remember, it was going to be another almost 40 years before the population would get back to where it was. And next slide. This is 1942. Sam Smith Shoes. This is like a war bond drive, and they're talking to them about the need for things they were doing. And a lot of the officers in World War II wore shoes from Sam Smith Shoe. Part of Essex, our McAllen company, was actually a distillery for alcohol until the night watchman decided he could have a cigarette in the building and decided it was okay to smoke outside the elevator shaft on the top floor, and he blew half the roof off of mill number 3. He didn't keep his job, but the distillery was there for a while longer. Then, of course, McAllen Company came in with mica insulation, an electronics industry, Abington Shoe, Rockingham Shoe, yes.
What did they distill?
It was just alcohol.
Just alcohol.
Yeah, it wasn't making whiskey or anything like that. It was just an alcohol distillery. And it was actually somewhat of a small operation, but they just needed big tanks and stuff. So the next slide. 1942, the Great Weave Shed is removed. This is them tearing down the steel from the overhead bridge. Lisa Liga, who used to be our town clerk, has great memories. She would run home from school after school to be the first one home to get her daddy's hammer, because you could go over to the mill site and you could chip bricks and you got a penny a brick for all the cement you chipped off if you didn't break the brick. And that kept all the kids in town in penny candy for years. Next slide. Fast forward, 1987. Just so you know that history does repeat itself. 1979, the Newmarket Service Club did a study called The New Life for Downtown Newmarket. And at the time we raised $35,000, which was a huge sum for a small organization, and hired the Thorson Group out of Portsmouth. And they told us that the mills were going to become obsolete and that Newmarket should tighten up its zoning and planning regulations and all of this, because growth was coming around Great Bay at us from both directions, and got laughed at, went on the shelf. 1987, which is 8 years later, I had a catering service in town, and I got a phone call from the foreman at United Technologies that he asked if I could cater a luncheon in the penthouse at the McAllen Company. And I said, sure. And he said, it's for the planning board and the zoning board and the selectmen. And I went, okay. And they announced that as of September 1st, this was in August, they were ceasing all operations and closing down and auctioning off equipment. So this was the second abandonment in the town of Newmarket of the mills. Fast forward to 1997, the town actually received the mills for $1. By that time, it wasn't pretty. There were tons of pigeon guano on the top floors, gaping holes in the roofs, trees growing up through the roof, broken windows. It was pretty sad. Next slide. October 2013 is when we signed the paperwork with Eric Chinberg for the Main Street side of the mills. So it's a rebirth. The interesting thing is, no matter what's happened in the town, through all the fires and the floods and everything else that have gone on, the mills have stood there, which is really interesting, because the last slide, the Newmarket Mills will celebrate their bicentennial next year, 200 years of the mills being in town. I'm going to end my presentation there because I've been long enough, and I don't want to put everyone to sleep, but the amount of history and the things that go on there is absolutely incredible. Next slide, David. One of the things, being in the Community Development Corporation, that we learned is that we need to preserve our heritage in the community. There were certain stipulations that were made when the mills were sold. One is that the weather vane had to stay on top of the cupola of the mills. It is a compass rose intersecting with gears. The gears denote industry. The compass rose are the 64 points of the compass around the globe, which denotes shipping out and things like that. So that's rather unique. The bell that sits in the tower was actually rescued from mill number 1 when it burned in 1857, and it was put in the tower there. And that bell used to ring at like 5:30 in the morning to warn people. 6 o'clock it rang, you had to be at work, or your pay got docked, you know, and then it would ring again at 6 o'clock at night for people to go home. So that bell has to remain in the tower, and we reserve the right to ring it with notice on occasion. The last time it was rung was when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, and we rang all the bells in town. The mill bells rang also. The photo that you see is actually of the main entrance for the employees at mill number 2. And the reason that's there is that those were the original doors. And if you look at the stone stoop, you see how worn it is? That is worn from all the feet of those workers going in and out of those mills. The Newmarket Manufacturing Company only lasted about 105 years in Newmarket. But they left us a legacy. So, anybody have questions? I hope I didn't bore you. Pat?
The strike and the close down happened about the same time as the Depression, right? So the stock market crash.
The stock market crash did not happen till October.
Does
Okay?
that have any bearing on?
By that point in time, it was moot. Nobody was talking to anyone. The only one that was really doing well, trying to keep the peace, was the editor of the Newmarket Advertiser. And he was editorializing, saying, hey, you need to sit down, you need to talk this out, you need to get together. It's a paramount interest to the community that you settle this difficulty. Because, I mean, and it wasn't just the workers, it was the mill owners, it was the businesses, and then he had a heart attack and died. The Newmarket Advertiser got sold to 2 young men in Hampton. Well, they wanted money, so they didn't care about trying to be peacemakers. So you started getting these big ads in the paper from the Newmarket businesses say, good workers are thankful for what they have and the opportunities that are offered them. Talk about propaganda. It was horrible. It was horrible.
Mem said that she always called it, she went on strike.
Yeah.
And she said half the town hated the family because of, you know, what it did.
Yep.
But she always said, no, we went on strike.
Yep. Yep. We had a member of our family that was one of the 17 ladies that walked out of the Silk Room. And if you ever knew who it was, you'd say, no, not her. She was ticked, and they had a right to be ticked.
Yeah, that's what she said.
They really did. Everybody else was getting raises. This was the high rolling times, you know, and it was almost as though they were looking for an excuse to leave the town, you know. So
Where did they go down?
I have a whole presentation on just the strike. So
Did they go to Lynn or Lawrence?
they went to Lowell. And actually, the town that fooled itself isn't my creation. It's actually a front page article that appeared in the Lowell Sun in 1932 about the Newmarket strike and the Newmarket Manufacturing Company bringing all their cotton looms to Newmarket, to Lowell, to the buildings there. And that was the title of the article, The Town That Fooled Itself. And it started laying things out. What?
They were sending a message to Lowell with that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yes.
I'm from Manchester originally.
Amnesty,
All the mills
yeah.
there and the workers' actions. And the mill owners at that time, we all eventually found out that they were looking at property down south so that they could move all the operations close to where the cotton came.
There is a speech that was given by Frank Gorman, who was the vice president of the International Brotherhood of Textile Workers in February of 1929 at Foresters Hall. We know it as the Stone Church. But that was like strike headquarters. And it was packed. And at the time, he was telling them that their cause was just and they had a right to strike. But he said, you have to remember that the nature of business is they will always move closer to their source of their product, their materials, down south. And they said, and then when that doesn't work, they will be looking for the cheapest source of labor they can find. And basically, he was talking about the off-site, manufacturing and stuff that we're seeing today and experiencing the shortages from COVID and everything because of that, because, Timberland opened up their big factory in Puerto Rico, But, so he was saying in 1929, this is the trend for business. So it's really interesting reading, yes.
But the reason, I guess, that they could move to the south was because of electricity. You could not support the weaving industry in most of the rivers in the south, whereas New England had a vast quantity of water power.
Yeah, but by the time the Depression hit,
Yeah.
it was the cost of shipping that cotton up here. And it's really interesting too, because we've got a book in the files at the museum that actually lists all the plantations they bought cotton from, how many bales and everything else, where it were shipped and all of this stuff. So it's really interesting to see, It was quite an operation. Any other questions? Yes?
What was the population in Newmarket at the height of manufacturing times?
The height of the manufacturing, I think it was about 4,700. In 52, when we were growing up, it was about 2,800 in Newmarket. Yeah, so. And remember, we used to have curfew. The whistle used to ring at 9 o'clock at night on the fire alarm. If you were under 16 and you weren't home, you got a free ride home in the cruiser. That only happened once. The parents were never happy.
John Barrier.
So, okay.